The dust hadn't even settled from Jake Matthews' boots when Sheriff Clayton made the declaration that would change everything. "Pick any woman in this town, cowboy, and I'll guarantee you a wife by sunset." Jake stood in the center of Millbrook's main street, his black hat casting shadows over steel-gray eyes that had seen too much of the world's cruelty. He'd ridden into town that morning with a string of prime cattle and a reputation that preceded him. Successful rancher from Texas, they whispered, with money enough to buy whatever he wanted. What Sheriff Clayton didn't know was that Jake Matthews had already lost everything that truly mattered. The challenge hung in the dusty air like gunpowder waiting for a spark. Around them, the town had gathered as word spread of the wealthy stranger's arrival. Shopkeepers abandoned their stores, farmers left their wagons, and women smoothed their skirts while pretending not to stare at the man who could afford to choose any bride he desired. "Any woman?" Jake asked quietly, his voice carrying despite its softness. There was something in his tone that made smart men step back and foolish ones lean forward. "Any woman," Sheriff Clayton confirmed, his chest puffed with the confidence of a man holding what he thought were all the winning cards. "This here's a town full of fine, marriageable ladies. Take your pick, and I'll perform the ceremony myself." Jake's gaze moved slowly across the assembled crowd, taking in the eager faces of young women pushed forward by ambitious mothers, the calculating expressions of fathers counting potential dowries, and the suspicious stares of men wondering what game was being played. Then his eyes found her. Molly Henderson stood at the very back of the crowd, partially hidden behind Mrs. Patterson's considerable frame. While other women had primped and positioned themselves to catch his attention, Molly seemed to be doing everything possible to disappear. Her brown hair was pulled back in a simple bun beneath a plain bonnet, and her full figure was draped in a practical brown dress that spoke of long hours in her father's bakery. But it was her eyes that caught Jake's attention, intelligent, kind, and holding a depth of understanding that the prettier, more eager candidates lacked. While others looked at him and saw dollar signs, Molly Henderson looked at him and saw something that made her take an involuntary step backward. She saw the same loneliness that lived in her own heart. "I've made my choice," Jake announced, his words cutting through the murmur of the crowd like a blade through silk. Sheriff Clayton's smile widened, no doubt calculating how much he could squeeze from this arrangement. The man's gambling debts were legendary, and a wealthy newcomer represented the solution to all his problems. "Excellent," Clayton boomed. "And which of our lovely ladies has caught your eye?" Jake stepped forward, his boots echoing on the wooden planks as he walked past the line of hopeful women. Past Sarah Mitchell with her golden curls and coy smile. Past Rebecca Walsh with her emerald dress and practiced flutter of eyelashes. Past them all until he stopped directly in front of the one woman who tried to hide. "I choose her," he said simply, extending his hand toward Molly Henderson. "I choose the obese one." The silence that followed was so complete that even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The silence stretched like a taut wire until someone in the crowd let out a nervous laugh that died as quickly as it had started. Molly Henderson's face drained of all color, her brown eyes wide with a mixture of shock, humiliation, and something that looked dangerously close to panic. "I beg your pardon?" Sheriff Clayton's voice cracked slightly, his confident smile faltering as he tried to process what he'd just heard. Jake didn't repeat himself. Instead, he kept his hand extended toward Molly, his gray eyes steady and patient. Around them, the crowd began to murmur, a low buzzing sound like wasps in a disturbed hive. "He can't be serious," someone whispered. "Maybe he's touched in the head," came another voice. "Poor Molly." This has to be some kind of cruel joke. The words hit Molly like physical blows, each whispered comment driving her deeper into herself. She'd spent 26 years in this town, watching other women get courted, married, and celebrated, while she remained invisible except when people needed fresh bread or were looking for someone to ridicule. Now to be singled out like this, as a spectacle, as some stranger's incomprehensible choice, felt worse than being ignored. "Sir," she said quietly, her voice barely audible above the crowd's murmur, "I think there's been a mistake." "No mistake," Jake replied, his hand still extended. "Miss Henderson, isn't it? I've heard about your bakery. They say you make the finest bread between here and Denver." The fact that he knew her name sent another ripple of surprise through the gathering. Molly blinked at him, trying to understand what game he was playing. Men like him, successful, handsome, clearly prosperous, didn't know the names of women like her unless they needed something baked for a special occasion. Sheriff Clayton cleared his throat loudly, regaining his composure as he realized this unexpected turn might actually work in his favor. A quick marriage to the town's unmarried baker's daughter would be easy to arrange, and it would still put him in Jake's debt. "Well now," Clayton said, forcing his politician's smile back into place, that's certainly an interesting choice. Molly's a fine woman, of course, very practical, good with her hands, excellent cook, no question about that." The way he said practical made it sound like a consolation prize, and Molly felt heat rise in her cheeks. She took a step backward, but Jake moved with her, keeping the same respectful distance. "Miss Henderson," Jake said, and there was something in his voice that made her look at him directly for the first time. "Would you do me the honor of walking with me? I'd like to speak with you privately before we proceed with any arrangements." The crowd pressed closer, eager to hear her response. Molly could feel the weight of every stare, could practically hear the thoughts racing behind their eyes. What could a man like that possibly want with her? Was this some elaborate bet? A moment of madness he'd regret as soon as he sobered up? But when she looked into Jake Matthews' eyes, she didn't see cruelty or jest. She saw something that looked almost like respect. She started, then stopped, glancing around at the sea of expectant faces. "I suppose we could walk." Jake nodded and offered his arm, the same courteous gesture he might have made to any lady in the crowd. Molly hesitated for a heartbeat before placing her hand lightly on his sleeve, and together they walked toward the edge of town, leaving behind a crowd buzzing with speculation. They walked in silence until they reached the small garden behind the Henderson bakery, where Molly's mother grew herbs and vegetables. The familiar scent of rosemary and thyme helped steady Molly's nerves, though her heart was still racing. "Why?" she asked finally, turning to face him. "Why did you choose me?" Jake removed his hat and ran a hand through his dark hair, and for the first time since she'd seen him, he looked uncertain. "May I be honest with you, Miss Henderson? I'd prefer it. I came to this town to buy cattle, not a wife. I have no intention of marrying anyone today, despite what I just told your sheriff." Molly's stomach dropped. Of course. Of course it had been too strange to be real. "So this is all some kind of game to you?" "No," Jake said quickly. "Not a game. A necessary deception, perhaps. You see, Sheriff Clayton has been sending me letters for months, promising prime cattle and other incentives if I'd come to Millbrook. When I arrived this morning, I discovered the cattle are mediocre at best, and the other incentives appear to involve pressuring me into a marriage that would benefit his financial situation more than mine." His financial situation? The man has gambling debts that could buy and sell this whole town. I suspect he was hoping to arrange a marriage that would either get him a substantial dowry or put him in the good graces of someone with money to lend. Molly absorbed this information, her mind working through the implications. "So you chose me because you knew I couldn't afford a dowry? Because marrying me would be worthless to him? I chose you because you're the only woman in that crowd who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else," Jake said simply. "And because when I asked around town this morning about where to get decent food, every person I spoke to mentioned your cooking with genuine admiration. That tells me something about your character." "My cooking?" Molly couldn't decide whether to laugh or cry. "You're willing to pretend to marry me because I can bake bread?" "I'm willing to help you escape a humiliating situation because you seem like a decent person who doesn't deserve to be made a spectacle of," Jake corrected, "and because I have a proposition that might benefit us both." Despite herself, Molly was curious. "What kind of proposition?" Jake leaned against the garden fence, his expression serious. "I need to stay in town for 3 more days to finalize some business arrangements. Sheriff Clayton won't leave me alone as long as he thinks there's money to be made from my presence. But if I'm engaged to someone he considers worthless to his schemes, he'll lose interest." "Engaged?" "Temporarily. We'd announce an engagement today, I'd conduct my business over the next few days, and then I'd leave town." You could break the engagement after I'm gone, claim you discovered we weren't compatible. Your reputation would be intact, maybe even enhanced. You'd be the woman who caught and released a wealthy suitor. Molly stared at him. And what would you get out of this arrangement? Peace to conduct my business. And, he hesitated, then continued, and the satisfaction of knowing I helped someone who's probably spent her whole life being overlooked get a taste of what it feels like to be chosen. The words hit closer to home than Molly was comfortable with. She turned away, pretending to examine her mother's tomato plants. You don't know anything about my life. I know what I see. I know that when other women were pushing forward to catch my attention, you were trying to disappear. I know that people speak of your skills with genuine respect, but no one mentioned you as a potential bride until I chose you myself. And I know that look in your eyes when people talk about you, like you're not standing right there. Molly's throat tightened. What look? The same one I see in my mirror every morning, Jake said quietly. The look of someone who's learned not to expect much from other people. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of unexpected understanding settling between them. Finally, Molly spoke without turning around. What if I say no? Then I'll go back to that crowd, apologize for my momentary madness, and conduct my business while dodging Sheriff Clayton's matchmaking schemes for the next 3 days. You'll go back to being invisible, and life will continue exactly as it was. And if I say yes, then for 3 days you'll be the most talked about woman in Millbrook. People will wonder what you have that caught the attention of a man who could have chosen anyone. Your name will be connected to mystery and romance instead of just bread and pastries. Molly finally turned back to face him. You make it sound appealing. I'm hoping it is. Because, Miss Henderson, I think you deserve to know what it feels like to be someone's first choice, even if it's just pretend. The offer hung between them like a bridge she could either cross or burn. Molly had spent her entire adult life watching other women live the experiences she'd dreamed of. Courtship, romance, being desired. Here was a chance to taste that life, even if it was built on deception. 3 days, she said slowly. 3 days. And then you leave, and I tell everyone it didn't work out. Exactly. Molly took a deep breath, thinking of the crowd waiting for their return, of the years of being overlooked, of the way Jake had said her name like it meant something. All right, she said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. Let's give this town something to talk about. When Jake smiled, really smiled, not the polite expression he'd worn for the crowd, Molly felt something flutter in her chest that she'd thought was dead and buried. Maybe pretending to be chosen wouldn't be the hardest part of this arrangement. Maybe the hardest part would be remembering it wasn't real. When they returned to the main street, the crowd had barely dispersed. If anything, more people had gathered, drawn by the irresistible magnetism of gossip in the making. Jake and Molly's absence had given everyone time to speculate wildly about what had transpired during their private conversation. Sheriff Clayton stepped forward immediately, his eyes bright with barely contained avarice. Well, have you two had a chance to discuss the arrangement? Jake placed his hand gently over Molly's where it rested on his arm, a gesture that didn't go unnoticed by the watching crowd. Miss Henderson has agreed to be my wife, he announced, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled townspeople. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd, followed by an explosion of whispered conversations. Molly felt her cheeks burn under the scrutiny, but Jake's steady presence beside her kept her from bolting. Wonderful, Clayton boomed, though his enthusiasm seemed forced. When shall we perform the ceremony? I'm available right now if you'd like to make it official immediately. We'll be married in 3 days, Jake said smoothly. Miss Henderson deserves time to prepare properly. A woman should have the wedding she's dreamed of, don't you think? The romantic sentiment earned approving nods from several of the women in the crowd, though Molly noticed more than a few skeptical expressions among the men. She suspected they were wondering, just as she was, what game Jake was really playing. Of course, Clayton agreed, though Molly caught the flicker of disappointment that crossed his features. 3 days it is. That'll give us time to plan a proper celebration. As the crowd finally began to disperse, chattering excitedly about this unexpected development, Jake turned to Molly. Would you mind showing me around town? I'd like to get to know my future home better. The word future sent an unexpected pang through Molly's chest, a reminder that this was all temporary. But she nodded, grateful for an excuse to escape the lingering stares. They walked slowly down Main Street, Jake asking thoughtful questions about the various businesses and Molly finding herself relaxing despite the surreal circumstances. He seemed genuinely interested in the town's history, the challenges facing the local farmers, and the personalities of the various shop owners. Tell me about your bakery, Jake said as they paused in front of Henderson's bread and pastries. Through the window, they could see Molly's father, Edgar, frantically kneading dough while customers lined up at the counter. It's been in our family for 15 years, Molly explained. Papa started it when we first came to Millbrook. Mama handles most of the customer service, and I do the majority of the baking. The majority? Molly's cheeks colored slightly. All of it, actually. Papa's hands shake too much now. Old injury from back east. And Mama's, well, her biscuits could be used as weapon ammunition. Jake's laugh was genuine and warm. So you're the real talent behind Henderson's reputation. I suppose so, though Papa would never admit it publicly. He thinks it reflects poorly on him to have his daughter doing the man's work of running the ovens. But you love it, Jake observed, noting the way her face lit up when she talked about baking. I do. Molly looked surprised by her own admission. Most people think it's just menial labor, but there's real skill involved. Understanding how different flours behave, how altitude affects rising, how to read the oven's moods. It's like a conversation between you and the ingredients. They were interrupted by the bell above the bakery door as Edgar Henderson emerged, his weathered face creased with confusion and something that might have been excitement. Molly, he called out. There you are. This gentleman here, he gestured toward Jake with flour-dusted hands. He's the one who's going to marry your daughter. Yes, sir, Jake said, extending his hand. Jake Matthews, it's a pleasure to meet you properly. Edgar shook the offered hand with obvious bewilderment. Edgar Henderson. I have to say, Mr. Matthews, this is all quite sudden. Molly never mentioned that there was anyone. It was a bit of a whirlwind courtship, Jake said smoothly. When you meet the right person, sometimes you just know. The lie came so easily that Molly almost believed it herself. Almost. Well, yes, I suppose. Edgar trailed off, clearly struggling to process the idea that his unmarried daughter had somehow attracted a prosperous suitor. Would you like to see the bakery? Molly's done amazing things with it. I'd be honored. The next hour passed in a blur of tours and introductions. Edgar proudly showed off the ovens Molly had redesigned for better heat distribution, the storage system she'd organized for maximum efficiency, and the recipe modifications she'd developed to accommodate the local wheat varieties. She's got a real head for business, too, Edgar continued, warming to his subject. Figured out which days to make extra of which items, how to reduce waste, even negotiated better prices with our suppliers. I don't know what I'd do without her. Jake listened attentively, asking intelligent questions and making observations that demonstrated he understood the complexities of running a food business. Molly found herself watching him more closely, trying to understand what kind of man would take such genuine interest in a small-town bakery. Would you mind if I tried some of your bread? Jake asked eventually. I've been hearing about it all morning. Molly cut him a thick slice of her morning's batch, a hearty wheat loaf with a golden crust that had taken her years to perfect. She watched nervously as he took his first bite, then relaxed as his eyes widened with appreciation. This is exceptional, he said, and she could tell he meant it. The texture, the flavor. I've eaten bread in fancy restaurants in Denver and San Francisco that couldn't compare to this. The compliment sent warmth spreading through Molly's chest. She was used to local praise, but Jake had traveled, had eaten food prepared by professional chefs. His opinion carried weight she hadn't expected. Thank you, she said quietly. That means a great deal coming from someone who's seen more of the world than most of us. Speaking of which, Jake said, I'd love to hear about your dreams. What would you do if you could go anywhere? Be anything. The question caught Molly off guard. No one had ever asked her about her dreams before. People assumed that a woman like her, unmarried, devoted to her family's business, had no dreams beyond what she was already doing. I, I don't know, she said honestly. I've never really thought about it. That's not true, Edgar interjected unexpectedly. Remember when you used to talk about opening a restaurant in Denver? You had all those ideas about regional cuisine, using local ingredients in new ways. Molly shot her father a surprised look. She'd forgotten he'd been listening to those long-ago conversations with her mother, back when she'd still believed anything was possible. That was just foolish talk, she said dismissively. Was it? Jake asked. It doesn't sound foolish to me. It sounds like you have vision and ambition. Vision and ambition don't mean much when you don't have the means to pursue them, Molly replied, but there was less conviction in her voice than usual. Means can be acquired. Vision and ambition are much rarer. Before Molly could respond, the bakery door opened and Mrs. Patterson bustled in, her eyes bright with curiosity and barely concealed excitement. Edgar! Molly, she exclaimed. I just had to come by and congratulate you on this wonderful news. Though I have to say, Molly, you certainly kept this courtship secret. None of us had any idea you were being courted by such a distinguished gentleman. It was private, Molly managed. Of course, of course. Young love often is. Mrs. Patterson turned to Jake with undisguised fascination. Mr. Matthews, isn't it? We're all so curious about how you met our Molly. She's always been such a devoted daughter, never showing interest in the local young men. Molly felt her face burning with embarrassment at the woman's obvious fishing for gossip, but Jake answered smoothly. Sometimes the best things in life are worth waiting for, Mrs. Patterson. I consider myself fortunate that Miss Henderson was still available when I finally had the good sense to notice what was right in front of me. The romantic answer seemed to satisfy Mrs. Patterson, though Molly noticed the slight emphasis Jake placed on finally, as if he'd known her for longer than a few hours. After Mrs. Patterson left with a promise to spread their romantic story throughout town, Molly found herself alone with Jake again. Edgar had retreated to the back room to handle the afternoon's baking, leaving them standing awkwardly by the counter. You're very good at this, Molly said quietly. At what? Playing the devoted fiancé, making people believe this is real. Jake was quiet for a moment, his gray eyes studying her face. Maybe it's not as much of a performance as I expected it to be. The words hung between them, loaded with implications that made Molly's heart skip. But before she could analyze what he meant, the bakery door opened again, bringing another wave of curious neighbors and well-wishers. As the afternoon wore on, Molly found herself swept up in the strange experience of being the center of positive attention. People who'd barely acknowledged her existence for years were suddenly treating her like someone important, someone worthy of congratulation and celebration. And through it all, Jake remained at her side, playing his part with a warmth and consistency that made it increasingly difficult to remember this was all pretend. When the last customer finally left and Edgar closed the shop for the day, Molly realized she'd actually enjoyed herself. For the first time in her adult life, she'd felt like the heroine of her own story instead of a supporting character in everyone else's. The question was, what would happen when the story ended? The second day of their engagement dawned with an autumn chill that promised winter's approach. Molly rose before sunrise, as was her habit, to begin the morning's baking. But as she worked the dough for the day's bread, her mind wasn't on measurements and temperatures. It was on the strange turn her life had taken. Jake had been nothing but a gentleman the previous evening. He'd escorted her home, met her mother with the same respectful courtesy he'd shown her father, and even complimented the simple dinner Martha Henderson had hastily prepared. But when he'd kissed her hand goodnight, a gesture clearly performed for the benefit of watching neighbors, Molly had felt a jolt of something that had nothing to do with their pretend arrangement. She was kneading more aggressively than necessary when she heard the bakery's back door creak open. Jake stepped inside, bringing the scent of morning air and leather with him. I hope you don't mind the intrusion, he said, removing his hat. I was hoping to catch you before the town wakes up. Of course. Molly tried to ignore the way her pulse quickened at his unexpected appearance. Is everything all right? That's what I'm trying to figure out. Jake's expression was serious as he approached the work counter. I had an interesting visit from Sheriff Clayton last night. Molly's hand stilled in the dough. What kind of visit? The kind where a man shows his true colors when he thinks no one important is watching. Jake leaned against the counter, his gray eyes dark with something that might have been anger. He came to my hotel room around midnight, drunk and desperate, started talking about opportunities for a man of my resources. What kind of opportunities? The illegal kind. Jake's voice was grim. Apparently, Sheriff Clayton has been skimming money from the town treasury to cover his gambling debts. He's also been taking bribes from cattle rustlers to look the other way when they pass through with stolen herds. Molly felt her stomach drop. He told you this? He was drunk enough to think I'd be interested in becoming a partner. Said a man with my cattle connections could help him expand his operation, make real money instead of the pennies he gets from legitimate law enforcement. The implications hit Molly like a physical blow. He thought marrying me would give him leverage over you. Make you more likely to trust him. Exactly. He kept referring to you as his insurance policy. Said once we were married, I'd be family, and family looks out for each other. Jake's jaw tightened. The man's been using this whole town as his personal piggy bank, and he saw our engagement as a way to expand his criminal enterprise. Molly sank onto a nearby stool, her legs suddenly unsteady. What did you tell him? That I needed time to think about it. But Molly. Jake moved closer, his voice gentle despite the serious subject matter. This changes things. Clayton isn't just a corrupt sheriff, he's dangerous. If he suspects we're not really engaged, or if he thinks I'm a threat to his operation, he'll come after us both, Molly finished quietly. I won't let that happen. But it means we need to be more careful, more convincing. Before Molly could ask what he meant, the front door chimed, announcing their first customer of the day. Mrs. Walsh entered, followed closely by her daughter Rebecca, one of the women who'd been positioned prominently during yesterday's selection. Good morning, Molly, Mrs. Walsh said, though her tone was notably cooler than usual. Mr. Matthews, how lovely to see you here so early. I couldn't stay away from the finest bakery in Colorado, Jake replied smoothly, moving to stand beside Molly in a gesture that seemed both protective and possessive. Rebecca Walsh's pretty face was pinched with something that looked suspiciously like envy. How romantic. Though I have to say, Mr. Matthews, you certainly work fast. Yesterday you'd never even spoken to Molly, and now you're practically living in her family's bakery. The barb was delivered with a sweet smile that didn't fool anyone. Molly felt heat rise in her cheeks, but Jake's response was immediate and firm. When you know, Miss Walsh. I've spent enough years of my life waiting for the right woman. I'm not about to waste any more time now that I've found her. He reached for Molly's flour-dusted hand and brought it to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. The gesture was tender and intimate, and Molly felt her breath catch despite knowing it was all for show. How sweet, Mrs. Walsh said, though she exchanged a meaningful look with her daughter. Well, we won't keep you lovebirds. Just 2 loaves of the wheat bread, please. As Molly wrapped their purchase, she could feel the 2 women studying every interaction between her and Jake, looking for cracks in their performance. It was Rebecca who delivered the next probe. I hope you won't take this the wrong way, Mr. Matthews, but some of us are wondering about your sudden devotion to our Molly. She's a dear girl, of course, but you could have your pick of women who are more traditionally suited to a man of your station. The implication was clear, and Molly felt her face burn with humiliation. But Jake's response surprised everyone in the room, including Molly herself. Miss Walsh, he said, his voice carrying a note of steel beneath its politeness. I'm going to assume that was simply poorly chosen words rather than a deliberate insult to my fiancé. Because if it was intentional, I'd have to wonder what kind of people I'm planning to make my neighbors. Rebecca's face went pale and her mother quickly stepped forward. Oh no, Mr. Matthews. I'm sure Rebecca didn't mean anything inappropriate. We're all just surprised by how quickly things have developed. Love doesn't follow a schedule, Jake replied, but his arm came around Molly's waist in a gesture that was unmistakably claiming. And I'd appreciate it if people would stop acting like Molly won some kind of lottery by catching my attention. The truth is, I'm the lucky one. After the Walsh women left, faster than they'd originally intended, Molly found herself alone with Jake again. The silence stretched between them until she finally spoke. You didn't have to do that. Yes, I did. Jake's voice was quiet but certain. No one has the right to make you feel less than worthy, especially not in your own family's business. People have been making comments like that about me my whole life. I'm used to it. Well, I'm not. Jake turned to face her fully, his gray eyes intense. And for the next day and a half at least, anyone who wants to insult you will have to go through me first. The fierce protectiveness in his voice sent an unexpected warmth through Molly's chest. She'd spent so many years defending herself that she'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone stand up for her. Their moment was interrupted by the arrival of Sheriff Clayton himself, who pushed through the front door with the aggressive confidence of a man who believed he owned the world around him. Well, well, he said, his eyes moving between Jake and Molly with calculating interest. The happy couple, hard at work already. How domestic. Sheriff, Jake replied neutrally. What can we do for you this morning? Just wanted to check on the wedding preparations? Make sure everything's proceeding smoothly. Clayton's smile was all teeth and no warmth. After all, it's my job to ensure the peace and happiness of our community. How thoughtful of you, Molly said, proud that her voice remained steady despite the man's obvious menace. I was also hoping to continue our conversation from last night, Jake. Clayton's tone was casual, but there was an undercurrent of threat. About those business opportunities we discussed. Jake placed his hand on the small of Molly's back, a gesture that appeared casual but felt distinctly protective. I'm still considering your proposal, Sheriff. These kinds of decisions shouldn't be made hastily. Of course not. But opportunities like this don't wait forever. A smart man knows when to act. Clayton's gaze shifted to Molly, and she didn't like what she saw there. Speaking of acting, I hope you're taking good care of your fiancé, Miss Henderson. A man like Jake needs to feel appreciated in his new community. The words were innocent enough, but the way Clayton said them made Molly's skin crawl. There was something possessive in his tone, as if he considered both her and Jake to be assets he could manipulate for his own benefit. Molly takes excellent care of me, Jake said firmly. Better than I deserve, actually. I'm sure she does. Clayton's smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. Well, I'll leave you two to your baking. But Jake, don't keep me waiting too long on that business matter. Some opportunities have expiration dates. After Clayton left, Molly realized she'd been holding her breath. The sheriff's visit had felt less like a social call and more like a threat wrapped in pleasantries. He knows, she said quietly. Knows what? That this isn't real. Or at least he suspects it. The way he was looking at us. The things he said. She shook her head. We're not fooling him. Jake was quiet for a long moment, considering her words. Maybe. Or maybe he's just the kind of man who questions everything because he assumes everyone else is as corrupt as he is. What are we going to do? We're going to be very, very convincing, Jake replied, and we're going to hope that 3 days is enough time for me to figure out how to protect us both from whatever Clayton is really planning. But as Molly watched Jake's troubled expression, she realized that their pretend engagement had become something much more dangerous than either of them had anticipated. They weren't just playing roles anymore. They were caught in a web of corruption and threat that could destroy them both. And the most terrifying part was that somewhere along the way, the line between pretense and reality had begun to blur in ways that made her heart race for reasons that had nothing to do with fear. By the afternoon of their second day, the novelty of Jake and Molly's engagement had worn off enough for the town's true feelings to surface. What had started as shocked curiosity was curdling into something uglier, whispered speculation that followed Molly wherever she went. She first noticed it when she visited Morrison's general store to pick up supplies for the bakery. The conversation at the counter stopped abruptly when she entered, and Mrs. Morrison's greeting was notably cooler than usual. Afternoon, Molly, the shopkeeper's wife said, her tone carefully neutral. I suppose you'll be needing different things now that you're engaged? Just the usual flour and sugar, Mrs. Morrison. Of course. The woman's eyes flicked toward the other customers. 3 wives from prominent families who were pretending to examine bolt fabric while obviously listening to every word. Though I imagine you'll need to learn some new skills soon. Managing a household for a man of Mr. Matthews' standing will be quite different well, from what you're used to. The condescension in her voice was subtle but unmistakable. Molly had spent her entire life in this store, and Mrs. Morrison had never questioned her competence before. I believe I can manage, Molly replied quietly, gathering her purchases. Oh, I'm sure you'll try your best, Mrs. Morrison continued, emboldened by her audience. It's just that men like Mr. Matthews, well, they're accustomed to a certain type of woman. Refined ladies who know how to dress properly, how to entertain, how to be ornamental, as well as useful. The words stung because they voiced every insecurity Molly had been trying to suppress. She was useful. Everyone acknowledged that. But ornamental, refined, those were qualities that had never been associated with the baker's daughter, who smelled of yeast and flour more often than perfume. Perhaps, said a cold voice from the doorway, Mr. Matthews is intelligent enough to value substance over ornamentation. Everyone turned to see Jake entering the store, his presence immediately commanding the room's attention. His gray eyes were fixed on Mrs. Morrison with an expression that could freeze water. Mr. Matthews, Mrs. Morrison's face flushed red. I didn't hear you come in. I heard exactly what you were doing, Jake replied, moving to stand beside Molly. You were questioning my judgment and insulting my fiancé. I'm curious, Mrs. Morrison. Do you make a habit of telling customers their choices are poor, or is this special consideration reserved for Miss Henderson? The store fell silent except for the ticking of the wall clock. The 3 women by the fabric bolts had given up all pretense of shopping and were staring openly at the confrontation. I didn't mean any insult, Mrs. Morrison stammered. I was simply expressing concern for Molly's adjustment to her new circumstances. How thoughtful, Jake said dryly. And what qualifications do you have to determine what kind of woman I need in my life? Mrs. Morrison's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Before she could formulate a response, one of the fabric-examining women spoke up. We're just surprised, Mr. Matthews, said Mrs. Blackwood, the banker's wife. Molly's a dear girl, but she's so practical. Men of your caliber usually prefer women with more social graces. Social graces, Jake repeated slowly, as if tasting the words. You mean the ability to make polite conversation while contributing nothing of value? The skill of looking pretty while others do the actual work? That's not what I meant, because if that's what you think I value, then you understand very little about the kind of man I am. Jake's voice carried the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being heard. I've traveled from Texas to Colorado, and I've never met a woman who can run a business, create something beautiful with her hands, and still have energy left to be kind to everyone around her. If you can't see the extraordinary nature of what Miss Henderson accomplishes every day, then perhaps the problem isn't with my choice, it's with your vision. Molly felt tears prick at her eyes, but they weren't tears of humiliation this time. No one had ever defended her so eloquently, so fiercely. Jake's words painted a picture of her that she'd never seen herself. Not as the makeshift baker who'd filled her father's shoes, but as someone remarkable in her own right. The women in the store exchanged uncomfortable glances, clearly realizing they'd overplayed their hand. But Mrs. Blackwood wasn't quite ready to concede defeat. Of course, Molly has many fine qualities, she said stiffly. We're simply concerned about compatibility. The differences in your backgrounds, your expectations. Our compatibility is our business, Jake replied firmly. But since you seem so concerned about expectations, let me clarify mine. I expect my wife to be intelligent. Molly is. I expect her to be capable. She runs this town's most successful business. I expect her to be kind. She's shown patience with people who clearly don't deserve it. And I expect her to be honest, something that seems to be in short supply in certain circles. The barb hit its mark. Mrs. Blackwood's face went pale, and she quickly gathered her things. Come, ladies. I believe we have other errands to attend to. The three women swept out of the store, leaving behind an awkward silence. Mrs. Morrison busied herself with unnecessary tasks behind the counter, clearly hoping the moment would pass without further comment. Jake gathered Molly's packages and offered her his arm. "Shall we continue our errands, my dear?" Outside the store, Molly found herself shaking, not from fear, but from the intensity of what had just occurred. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly. "Yes, I did." Jake's voice was still edged with anger. "What they were doing was cruel and unnecessary. But now they'll be even more convinced that something's wrong with our engagement. Women like Mrs. Blackwood don't usually get dressed down by wealthy strangers. She'll make sure everyone knows about this." "Good. Maybe others will think twice before making similar comments." They walked in silence for a few moments before Molly spoke again. "Jake, you described me like I was someone special. You are someone special. But we both know this is just pretend." Jake stopped walking and turned to face her. "The engagement might be pretend, Molly, but those qualities I described, those are real, and anyone who can't see them is either blind or willfully ignorant." Before Molly could respond, they were interrupted by a commotion from the direction of the saloon. Raised voices carried on the afternoon air, and Jake's expression immediately grew alert. "Stay here," he said, but Molly was already following him toward the disturbance. A crowd had gathered outside Murphy's saloon, and through the gaps between bodies, Molly could see Sheriff Clayton in heated discussion with a group of men she recognized as local ranch hands. The conversation appeared to be growing more intense by the moment. "Don't care what you think you saw," Clayton was saying, his voice loud enough to carry. "Unless you've got proof, you'd best keep your speculation to yourself." "We know what we know," replied Tom Mitchell, one of the more respected cowboys in the area. "And what we know is that our cattle didn't just wander off by themselves. Someone's been running organized operations through this valley." "That's a serious accusation, Mitchell." "It's a serious problem, Sheriff, and some of us are starting to wonder why you haven't been more motivated to solve it." Molly felt Jake tense beside her. This was exactly the kind of confrontation he'd warned her about, the moment when Clayton's criminal activities might be exposed. Clayton's hand moved to rest on his gun. "I'd be real careful about what you're implying, Mitchell. A man can get himself into trouble making accusations he can't back up. And a lawman can get himself into trouble ignoring crimes he's supposed to be solving," Mitchell shot back. The tension in the crowd was palpable. Several men had their hands near their weapons, and Molly could sense that the situation was on the verge of exploding into violence. That's when Clayton spotted Jake in the crowd. "Well, well," he said loudly, his voice carrying a note of false joviality. "If it isn't our distinguished visitor, Matthews, perhaps you could help settle a dispute. These men seem to think there's been organized cattle rustling in the area. As someone with experience in the cattle business, what's your professional opinion?" It was a trap, and everyone knew it. Clayton was forcing Jake to either support his position or publicly contradict the local sheriff. Either choice could be dangerous. Jake stepped forward slightly, his posture calm but ready. "In my experience, Sheriff, cattle rustling is usually an inside job. The perpetrators tend to be people who know the area well, who understand local schedules and routes, and who have enough authority to avoid suspicion." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. Clayton's eyes narrowed, clearly recognizing the implicit accusation. "Interesting theory," Clayton said slowly. "Of course, sometimes outsiders come into an area specifically to scout out opportunities. Strangers who ask a lot of questions, who seem very interested in local business practices." Now it was Jake who was being accused, and Molly felt her heart racing. The two men faced each other across the crowd, each clearly aware that their careful dance of mutual suspicion was coming to an end. "I suppose," Jake said quietly, "the truth will come out eventually." "It usually does." "Yes," Clayton replied, his hand still resting on his gun. "It usually does." As the crowd began to disperse, with the immediate confrontation diffused, but the underlying tension unresolved, Molly realized that their 3-day charade was rapidly becoming something much more dangerous, and tomorrow was supposed to be their wedding day. That evening, as Molly closed the bakery for what was supposed to be the last time before her wedding, she found Jake waiting for her in the garden behind the building. He stood with his back to her, staring up at the stars that were just beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Second thoughts? She asked quietly, joining him among her mother's herb plants. Many thoughts, he replied without turning around, most of them about tomorrow. Tomorrow, their fake wedding day, which was rapidly approaching whether they were ready or not. Molly had spent the day trying not to think about it, focusing instead on the routine tasks of baking and serving customers. But now, with the sun setting and the hours dwindling, the reality was impossible to ignore. Jake, she began, then stopped, unsure how to voice the questions that had been building inside her all day. What is it? When you leave the day after tomorrow, where will you go? He finally turned to face her, and in the fading light, she could see something haunted in his expression. Back to Texas, I suppose. Back to my ranch. You have a ranch? Had. I sold it before coming here. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she'd begun to recognize as a sign of his discomfort. That's part of what I haven't told you, Molly. Part of what I should have explained from the beginning. She felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. What haven't you told me? Jake was quiet for so long that she wondered if he'd changed his mind about confiding in her. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. I told you I came here to buy cattle, but that wasn't entirely true. I came here to disappear. Disappear? 3 months ago, my wife died. The words hit Molly like a physical blow. Wife. He'd had a wife, and she died recently. Everything about their conversation, their arrangement, suddenly took on a different meaning. Jake, I'm so sorry. I had no idea. Her name was Caroline, he continued, as if he needed to get the words out before he lost his courage. We'd been married for 8 years. She was everything people expected in a rancher's wife. Beautiful, accomplished, came from a good family. Everything that people in this town seem to think you're not. Molly felt something twist in her chest. You loved her. I thought I did. For years, I convinced myself that what we had was love. Caroline certainly looked the part of a devoted wife. She hosted dinner parties, wore the right clothes, said the right things. But, Jake turned away again, his hands clenched at his sides. But she was having an affair. Had been for over 2 years. With my best friend, my business partner, the man I trusted more than anyone else in the world. The betrayal in his voice was so raw that Molly instinctively stepped closer, wanting to offer comfort even though she didn't know how. I found out 3 weeks before she died, Jake continued. Caught them together in our own home. Caroline didn't even try to deny it. She told me she'd never loved me, that she'd married me for security and status, and that she'd been planning to leave with him as soon as they could figure out how to take half my assets. Oh, Jake. The worst part was that everyone knew. The whole town knew, and they'd been laughing at me behind my back for months. The successful rancher who was too stupid to see what was happening under his own roof. Molly felt tears burning behind her eyes. The humiliation he described was all too familiar. The sense of being the last to know, of being the object of pity and gossip. How did she die? She asked gently. Riding accident. She was trying to meet him for another rendezvous when her horse spooked and threw her. Broke her neck. His voice was completely flat now, drained of emotion. The whole town turned out for her funeral. They praised her as the perfect wife, talked about what a tragedy it was, how devoted we'd been to each other. And I stood there listening to it all, knowing it was a lie. That's why you sold the ranch. I couldn't stay. Every day people would offer their condolences, tell me how lucky I'd been to have such a wonderful woman. The man she'd been planning to run away with became one of my pallbearers. I felt like I was suffocating in their sympathy and my own anger. Jake finally turned back to face her, and Molly could see the pain etched in every line of his face. So I sold everything, took what money I could, and started looking for a place where no one knew me, where I could just exist without everyone watching me with pity. And you chose Millbrook because it was far enough from Texas that no one would know my story. Because Sheriff Clayton's letters made it sound like a simple cattle buying trip. I never intended to stay more than a few days. He paused, then added quietly, I certainly never intended to get involved in anyone else's life. The weight of his confession settled between them like a stone dropped into still water. Molly understood now why he'd been so quick to see through the town's surface judgments, why he'd been so fierce in defending her against people who valued appearance over substance. "That's why you were so angry when those women criticized me today," she said, "because you've seen what happens when people only value what looks good on the surface." Partly, but also because he stepped closer, close enough that she could see the sincerity in his eyes. "Because in 2 days, I've learned more about real character from watching you work, watching you handle difficult people with grace, watching you create something beautiful with your own hands, than I learned in 8 years of marriage to someone everyone considered perfect." The words sent warmth flooding through Molly's chest, but they also brought a sharp edge of pain, because tomorrow they would stand in front of the town and promise to love each other, and the day after that, he would leave, and she would never see him again. "Jake," she said carefully, "what happens tomorrow? With the wedding, I mean. Now that I know, now that I understand why you're really here." "Nothing changes," he said quickly. "We go through with the ceremony, I finish my business, and then I leave as planned. You can tell people whatever you want about why it didn't work out. But it feels different now. Knowing about Carolyn, knowing what you've been through. It doesn't have to feel different, but it does." The words came out more forcefully than she'd intended. "Because now I know that when you defended me today, when you've been treating me like I matter, it wasn't just part of our arrangement. It was real." Jake was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "Molly, you need to understand something. I'm not the man you deserve. I'm someone who was too blind to see his own wife's betrayal, too trusting to recognize when people were lying to my face. I'm broken in ways that might never heal." "You're not broken," she said firmly. "You're hurt. There's a difference." "Is there?" "Because from where I'm standing, it feels like the same thing." Molly took a step closer, close enough to reach out and touch his arm. "Jake, look at me." Reluctantly, he met her eyes. "In the past 2 days, you've shown me more kindness and respect than I've received from anyone else in my entire adult life. You've made me feel valuable, worthy, like I'm someone worth defending. That's not the behavior of a broken man. That's the behavior of someone who understands what real worth looks like because he's learned to recognize what's false." Jake stared down at her, and she could see the conflict playing out across his features. "Molly, I know this is just pretend," she continued, her voice growing stronger. "I know you're leaving, and I know this arrangement was never supposed to be about real feelings. But I need you to know that what you've given me these past 2 days, the way you've made me feel about myself, that's the most real thing that's ever happened to me." The silence that followed was charged with everything they weren't saying, everything they couldn't say given the circumstances. Finally, Jake reached up and gently touched her cheek. "You deserve so much more than a broken-down widower with trust issues and a pocket full of regrets," he said softly. "Maybe," Molly replied, leaning into his touch despite herself, "but maybe what I deserve and what I want aren't the same thing." Before Jake could respond, they heard footsteps approaching through the garden. They sprang apart just as Edgar Henderson appeared around the corner of the building. "Molly, there you are. Your mother's looking for you. Something about finalizing the arrangements for tomorrow." Edgar's gaze moved between them, taking in their obvious tension. "Everything all right out here?" "Everything's fine, Papa," Molly said, hoping her voice sounded steadier than she felt. "We were just talking about tomorrow." "Good, good. Nervous, are you?" "Perfectly natural. Your mother was a wreck the night before our wedding." Edgar beamed at Jake. "You're getting a good woman, Matthews. I hope you know that." "I do," Jake replied, and the quiet intensity in his voice made Molly's heart skip. "I know exactly what I'm getting." As they walked back toward the house, Molly realized that tomorrow's ceremony would be both the beginning and the end of something she was only just beginning to understand, and she wasn't sure her heart would survive either one. The morning of their wedding dawned crisp and clear, with autumn sunlight streaming through Molly's bedroom window like a benediction. She sat at her small dressing table, staring at her reflection while her mother fussed with the buttons on her wedding dress, a simple but elegant creation in cream-colored silk that had been hastily altered to fit. "You look beautiful, sweetheart," Martha Henderson said, though her voice carried a note of uncertainty. Are you sure about this? I know it's been a whirlwind, and if you're having second thoughts... Molly met her mother's eyes in the mirror. I'm sure, Mama. It wasn't entirely a lie. She was sure about something. She just wasn't certain what the something was anymore. What had started as a practical arrangement to help Jake avoid Sheriff Clayton's schemes had evolved into something far more complicated, something that made her chest tight with emotions she didn't fully understand. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Molly? Edgar's voice called from the hallway. Someone's here to see you. Tell them I'll be down shortly, Papa. I'm almost ready. Actually, Edgar said, opening the door just enough to peer inside, I think you should come now. It's Sheriff Clayton, and he seems agitated. Molly's blood ran cold. She exchanged glances with her mother, both of them immediately understanding that whatever had brought Clayton here on her wedding morning couldn't be good. I'll be right down, Molly said, standing carefully to avoid wrinkling her dress. She found Clayton pacing in their small parlor like a caged animal, his usual veneer of false joviality completely absent. When he saw her descend the stairs, his eyes raked over her wedding dress with an expression that made her skin crawl. Miss Henderson, he said, not bothering with pleasantries. Or should I say, soon-to-be Mrs. Matthews. How lovely you look. Thank you, Sheriff. Papa said you wanted to speak with me. I do indeed. You see, I've been doing some thinking about your fiancé, and some interesting information has come to my attention. Molly forced herself to remain calm despite the alarm bells going off in her head. What kind of information? Clayton smiled, but it was the expression of a predator who'd cornered his prey. It seems Mr. Matthews isn't quite who he's claimed to be. I sent some telegrams to contacts in Texas asking about a successful rancher named Jake Matthews. Very interesting responses I received. I'm not sure what you're implying, Sheriff. I'm implying that your beloved fiancé has been less than honest about his circumstances. Did you know, for instance, that he recently sold his ranch for significantly less than it was worth? That he left Texas under what some might call suspicious circumstances? Each word felt like a punch to Molly's stomach, not because she was shocked by the information. Jake had told her most of it himself the night before, but because she realized Clayton was building towards something dangerous. A man's business affairs are his own concern, she said carefully. Oh, but they're not, my dear. Not when that man comes into my town making grand gestures and upsetting the natural order of things. Not when he starts asking questions about local business practices and making accusations about law enforcement. Clayton stepped closer, and Molly had to fight the urge to back away. You see, I've realized that Mr. Matthews represents a problem that needs to be resolved. And you, Miss Henderson, are going to help me resolve it. I don't understand. It's quite simple. You're going to go through with this wedding ceremony, and then you're going to convince your new husband that his interests lie in cooperating with my various enterprises. If he proves amenable to partnership, then you'll both live happily ever after. If not, the threat hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. Molly felt ice flooding her veins as she realized the full scope of Clayton's plan. And if I refuse to help you? Clayton's smile widened. Then I'll be forced to arrest Mr. Matthews on suspicion of cattle rustling. Seems there have been several reports of a man matching his description, scouting ranch properties in the weeks before recent thefts. Very serious charges, cattle rustling. Could lead to a hanging depending on how the evidence develops. That's ridiculous. Jake would never. Evidence has a way of appearing when it's needed, Miss Henderson, especially when the local sheriff is motivated to find it. Before Molly could respond, the sound of approaching horses reached them through the open window. Clayton moved to peer outside, and his expression shifted to one of satisfaction. Ah, perfect timing. It seems your groom has arrived for the ceremony. Through the window, Molly could see Jake dismounting in front of their house, dressed in a black suit that made him look devastatingly handsome. Behind him rode three men she didn't recognize, their hard faces and prominent weapons marking them as the kind of men who solve problems with violence. Insurance, Clayton explained, noting her stare, just to make sure everyone understands the seriousness of the situation. Molly's mind raced, trying to find a way out of the trap that was closing around them. But before she could formulate a plan, Jake was knocking on their front door, and Edgar was ushering him into the parlor. "Sheriff," Jake said, his voice carefully neutral as he took in Clayton's presence. "I wasn't expecting to see you here. Just wanted to make sure everything was proceeding smoothly," Clayton replied. "Miss Henderson and I were just discussing the terms of your new partnership." Jake's eyes flicked to Molly, and she saw him register the fear in her expression. His posture shifted almost imperceptibly, becoming more alert, more dangerous. "What partnership would that be?" "The one we discussed the other night, about expanding business opportunities in the area." Clayton's hand rested casually on his gun. "Miss Henderson is quite eager for you to accept my generous offer." "Is that so?" Jake's gaze remained fixed on Molly's face. "And what does Miss Henderson think about this partnership?" It was a moment of choice, perhaps the most important moment of Molly's life. She could play along with Clayton's scheme, try to protect Jake by convincing him to cooperate with the corrupt sheriff's criminal enterprise, or she could trust that the man who defended her against gossips and treated her like she mattered would find a way to protect them both. "I think," Molly said clearly, "that you should know Sheriff Clayton has been threatening to frame you for cattle rustling if you don't agree to become his partner in crime." The silence that followed was electric with tension. Clayton's face went dark with fury, while Jake's expression became deadly calm. "I see," Jake said quietly. "And what crime exactly is the sheriff hoping I'll partner with him in?" "Taking bribes from rustlers, skimming from the town treasury, and using his badge to cover illegal cattle operations," Molly continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "He's been bleeding this town dry, and he thought marrying me would give him leverage over you." Clayton's hand moved to his gun, but Jake was faster. In one fluid motion, he drew his own weapon and had it trained on the sheriff before Clayton could clear leather. "I wouldn't," Jake said conversationally. "My friends outside are watching through the windows, and they're considerably better shots than your hired men." "Friends?" Clayton's eyes darted toward the windows. "Did you really think I'd come to a wedding without backup? Especially when I suspected the local sheriff might try something dramatic?" Jake's smile was cold as winter steel. "Those aren't your men outside, Clayton. They're U.S. Marshals." The color drained from Clayton's face. "That's impossible." "Is it? You see, when I sold my ranch in Texas, I didn't just disappear into the wilderness. I contacted federal authorities about some suspicious activities I'd been hearing about in this area. Cattle rustling, corruption, mysterious disappearances of travelers with money, the kind of problems that require federal investigation." Molly stared at Jake in amazement. "You're working with the Marshals?" "In a manner of speaking, they asked me to come here, establish myself in the community, and gather evidence of Clayton's criminal activities. The cattle buying story was a cover, though I did plan to actually buy some cattle to make it convincing." "And the engagement?" Molly's voice was barely a whisper. Jake's expression softened as he looked at her. "The engagement was supposed to be part of the cover, a reason to stay in town longer, to ask more questions without arousing suspicion, but it became something else entirely." Clayton made a desperate lunge for his gun, but Jake was ready for him. The sheriff found himself face down on the Hendersons' parlor floor, with a marshal's gun pressed to the back of his neck, before he could draw breath to curse. "Sheriff Clayton," said one of the marshals as he entered through the front door, "you're under arrest for corruption, conspiracy, and cattle rustling. You have the right to remain silent, though I doubt you'll exercise it." As Clayton was hauled away, still protesting his innocence, Molly found herself alone with Jake in her family's parlor. The man she'd agreed to marry under false pretenses had turned out to be working under even falser pretenses than she'd imagined. "So," she said finally, sinking into a chair as the enormity of the situation hit her, "you're a federal agent?" "Not exactly. More of a consultant. The Marshals needed someone who could blend into the cattle buying community without raising suspicion." Jake holstered his weapon and approached her carefully. "Molly, I know this changes everything. I know you must feel deceived." "Deceived?" Molly looked up at him, and to his surprise, she was almost smiling. "Jake, you just saved this entire town from a corrupt sheriff who was bleeding it dry. You risked your cover to protect me from his threats. How could I feel deceived by that? Because I lied to you about who I was, why I was here. You told me you came here to disappear, to escape your past. That was true, wasn't it? The marshals just gave you a way to do it while serving justice. Jake stared at her, amazed by her ability to see through to the heart of things. Caroline was real. The betrayal, the pain, the need to start over. All of that was true. The marshal work just gave me a purpose beyond my own hurt. And us? Our engagement. Was any of that real? Jake moved closer, close enough to take her hands in his. Molly, when I chose you from that crowd 3 days ago, it was supposed to be strategy. You were right. I picked you because you seemed least likely to complicate my mission. But everything that happened after that, after that, I fell in love with you. The words came out in a rush, as if he'd been holding them back with physical effort. I fell in love with your strength, your kindness, your intelligence, the way you create beauty with your hands and patience in your heart. I fell in love with how you see people for who they really are, instead of who they pretend to be. Molly felt tears stinging her eyes. But you're still leaving. Not if you don't want me to. Jake's voice was uncertain, vulnerable in a way she'd never heard before. The marshal work is finished here. Clayton will go to prison, his network will be dismantled, and justice will be served. But I don't have anywhere else I need to be. No other life waiting for me. What are you saying? I'm saying that if you'll have me, not as part of some arrangement or federal investigation, but as a man who loves you and wants to build a real life with you, then I'd like to stay. I'd like to make Millbrook my home. Molly stood up, her wedding dress rustling around her. Through the window, she could see the wedding guests beginning to gather in their front yard, unaware of the drama that had just unfolded inside. Jake Matthews, she said, stepping close enough to place her hands on his chest. Are you asking me to marry you? Really marry you? Not just for show? I'm asking you to take a chance on a broken-down widower who's learned the difference between what looks good and what is good. I'm asking you to believe that love can grow from the strangest circumstances and become something real and lasting and true. Instead of answering with words, Molly rose up on her toes and kissed him. It was their first real kiss, not performed for an audience, not part of any deception, but born from genuine feeling and the promise of a future neither of them had dared to imagine. When they finally broke apart, Jake rested his forehead against hers. Is that a yes? That's a yes to the man who saw me when everyone else looked through me. Yes to the man who defended my worth when I'd forgotten I had any. Yes to building something real from the most unlikely beginning. As they walked outside together to face their wedding guests, Molly realized that sometimes the best love stories were the ones that started with the wrong reasons, but found their way to the right ending. And sometimes, just sometimes, choosing the unexpected option led to exactly the life you never knew you wanted. 6 months later, Molly Matthews stood in the expanded kitchen of Henderson's Bakery and Restaurant, putting the finishing touches on a 3-layer wedding cake for the Kowalski family. The morning sun streamed through new, larger windows, illuminating the bustling establishment that had become the heart of Millbrook's dining scene. Mrs. Matthews, called Rosa Chen, their new assistant baker, the dinner rolls are ready for the lunch service. Perfect timing, Molly replied, wiping flour from her hands. The title still sent a little thrill through her. Mrs. Matthews, wife to the man who'd chosen her when no one else saw her worth. The transformation of their lives had been remarkable. After their real wedding ceremony, performed the same day as originally planned, but with genuine vows and hearts full of love, Jake had used his federal connections and his own resources to help modernize the bakery. What had started as a simple bread shop was now a full restaurant featuring Molly's innovative frontier cuisine. The lunch crowd is starting to gather, Jake announced, entering through the back door with dirt on his boots and satisfaction on his face. He'd spent the morning working on their new house, a home they were building together on land just outside town, designed with both of their dreams in mind. How's the construction coming? Molly asked, accepting the quick kiss he pressed to her forehead. Foundation solid. Just like us. He grinned at her, the shadows that had haunted his eyes when he first arrived in Millbrook completely gone. The changes hadn't been limited to their personal lives. With Sheriff Clayton in federal prison, the town had elected honest leadership and was thriving like never before. The cattle rustling had stopped. Local businesses were prospering, and travelers once again felt safe passing through the valley. "Mr. and Mrs. Matthews," Edgar Henderson called from the dining room, "you have visitors." They emerged to find Marshall Thompson and his partner, who'd become regular visitors during their trips through the territory. But more surprising was the young couple standing beside them, newlyweds by the look of their matching nervousness and joy. "Jake, Molly," Marshall Thompson said with a warm smile, "I'd like you to meet the Hendersons." "No relation," he added with a glance at Edgar. "They're traveling from Kansas to California and heard about your establishment. Seems word of your hospitality has spread pretty far." The young woman stepped forward shyly. "We heard about your story," she said to Molly, "about how you proved that love doesn't depend on what people expect. It gave us courage to marry despite what others said about our differences." Molly looked at the couple. He was clearly educated and well-dressed, while she wore the simple clothing of a farmer's daughter. Another unlikely pairing that had found love despite social expectations. "The heart sees what matters," Molly said gently. "Everything else is just noise." As they served the travelers and listened to their own love story, Jake caught Molly's hand and squeezed it gently. She looked up at him and saw the same amazement in his eyes that she felt every day. Wonder that they'd found each other, that they'd built something beautiful from the most practical beginning. Outside, the town of Millbrook bustled with honest prosperity. Inside, two hearts that had learned the difference between what looked right and what was right continued to choose each other, day after day. Sometimes the most beautiful love stories began with the words, "I choose the obese one." And sometimes choosing differently changed everything. If this story touched your heart, hit that like button and subscribe to Wild West Stories for more tales of unexpected love and frontier courage. Tell us in the comments, do you believe true love can bloom from the most unlikely circumstances? What would you have done in Molly's place? Join us next time for another incredible story of love conquering all odds in the untamed American West.